Hi everybody, welcome back. This is part 2 of my commentary, of which I have a lot to say about Oprah's episode about adult children who have chosen estrangement from their parent. So let's just go ahead and jump right in, and with that, here's part 2. Well, then they move on and they introduce Dr. Lindsay C. Gibson, and she wrote the book Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, and I was so thrilled to see that she was on the show because that's actually the first book I ever read on this subject. I read it just a few weeks after I went no contact with my mom. My mother does better fit the covert narcissist, I think. But this book gave me so much clarity on my mother's behavior, because narcissism is if someone's a narcissist, they're emotionally immature. So she would certainly qualify for that too. But it really helped me better understand my mother's behavior. And it also helped me understand my grandfather's behavior toward my mother, and even more so, his mother's behavior toward him. And I don't know anything further back in our family than that, but it really helped me see the generational traumas that have happened, and it just helped me better understand why what happened to me did happen to me. There was a lot of peace in that, and just that improved understanding of my situation. And I will say, becoming more able to think of my mother as a child and what she endured in her childhood, that is not an excuse in any way her abuse toward me. But it does give me some sympathy for her. Now, that's definitely harder for me to do when I think of her as an adult and the horrible ways she treated me. But it still helped me to see her as a child more in the time of her life when she was more innocent and being treated the way she was, which was very awful. And that really has helped me in a variety of ways. This book was just such a huge help for me. It's what got me on my path to healing, whereas before that I was just sort of numb and distraught and didn't know what to do next or how to move forward. And this book started me on that path to actually healing and moving forward. So it was so neat to just see her and hear what led her to write the book. And she wrote it because she shared that, she's a therapist and people were coming in with some stressor in her life that had nothing to do with their parents. But as they got into the sessions, things would come up about their family, their parents, and the problems that were there. And then she began to see that often people with parents with these kinds of problems, they had learned these coping mechanisms and behaviors to deal with their parents' treatment toward them, and then they were using those behaviors in other relationships, and then that was causing a lot of stress in many of their relationships, and was ultimately what was leading them to come in. So, she didn't say this, but as an example, if someone was just feeling isolated and lonely, and they're, arguing a lot, and they're unhappy, and, their relationships are just, in chaos, and then over time, talking about this and kind of pinpointing, well, you have these fairly toxic behaviors that you learned because you had to survive your relationship with your mother, and then you went into adulthood, and that's how what had been normalized to deal with other people. And that was some wise insight, because I know for me, especially earlier in my life, I didn't know how to build healthy relationships with other people. How could I have? I'd never had one. We learned so much about how to interact with people from our parents. And, first of all, I had relationships with many toxic people, even abusive people, just unhealthy people maybe is a better way of saying it, because that had just been so normalized. That's what I was attracted to. We move toward the familiar, even if the familiar is bad. And so, for one, I was already in relationships with these very unhealthy people who also had very toxic behaviors in relationships. But then, on top of that, yes, I was not completely just doing everything right, was attacked by all these people. I had behaviors that I had learned, like I said, to survive during my childhood and teenage years, my relationship with my mother. And then that's how I interacted with people in general, because that's all I knew to do. And so she saw that pattern and she decided to write this book to help people, which actually, I mean, I read the whole book. She does not tell people at all to go no contact. In fact, the latter part of the book was not helpful to me because the very last section is all about how to be with your emotionally immature parent without them damaging you or at least lessening the damage. And for me, that's just not really a realistic goal. Not with my mother. Maybe it is for other people. So, and like I said, I was already no contact and already made that decision. So she definitely does not tell people to go no contact. Oprah asked her, like, what kind of problems would a person bring in that would lead her to advise the person to go no contact? And I so appreciate her response because Dr. Coleman had already said on there that there's this epidemic of therapists telling everybody to go no contact with their parents. And what she said just totally goes against that narrative that he had just pushed, and that's being pushed by so many. She said she doesn't tell anyone to terminate contact with a parent, that it's not her place to do that. Instead, she helps them learn how to look within and determine to do, what to do on their own. And I can say I'm getting a master's in social work right now, and I've taken some just very early foundational courses about the therapeutic process. And that's exactly what I'm being taught, that we don't tell people what to do. We don't walk in assuming we are the expert in their situation. That's completely inappropriate. We walk in knowing they're the expert on their life and their situation. And we're more there as a support system while they gain clarity. And once they get that clarity, they will naturally know what's best for them to do. And then we support and trust them in that. And, not all therapists are good therapists. That could be said of any profession. There's just people that go into a profession that wasn't right for them. But people are not being trained to just tell people to cut off contact with any person that they don't get along with. That's just not happening. Well, then Oprah introduces the third expert, Nedra Glover Tawwab. I hope I'm saying her name correctly. I can't remember if it's Dr. Nedra Glover Tawwab, and I apologize. It's off the top of my head. I don't recall. She has a large online following, and she calls herself the Boundary Queen. She's written a book called Drama Free that's all about managing unhealthy family relationships. And she also confirmed that she does not ever tell her clients to go no contact with their parent. And she describes no contact not as a first option, but as a last resort, and I so appreciated that. I don't think I need to belabor because I've said enough here already, but just, when someone decides to become an orphan, you're kind of at the last resort, right? And so she just goes on to describe how she assists clients who are discussing problems with a parent and determining if they've tried other options. Are there other ideas they haven't tried? Like just finding out, asking them, have they truly tried talking about the problem? If they have, how did it go? How did it affect them? Is this just an annoying problem? Is this truly toxic? And that her role as a therapist is to assist people in determining the answers to those questions themselves. And then that way they can make a choice about what to do, which may be no contact, that may be low contact, that may be talking about a problem more effectively when that's appropriate. So I just, again, appreciate countering this narrative that there's just this epidemic of therapists telling people to cut off their parents. And, this really hits home for me because that's exactly what my mother and sister tell people that happened in our family, is that I went to this therapist who convinced me that my mother is a covert narcissist and that I should not have contact with her. That is a story I hear back from people time and again. I have a golden child brother who's actually been a great support to me. I'm very lucky in that way. And he agrees that our mother has this disorder. And even that is then I've taken the impact of this therapist and then convinced him and manipulated him. And it's just, like I said, I went no contact long before I began to see a therapist. I learned about covert narcissism first, and it was actually in response to that I began to realize how much that explained what I'd experienced, how serious this was. That's what helped me see, I think I need to see a therapist because this really sounds like it's what happened to me, and this is very damaging to a person, and I bet I have taken on damage that I don't fully understand, which was true. I learned so much about how much this trauma impacts me and my behavior and my relationships. My life is so different now after the help I received. But anyway, I guess it's just hard because, going through the therapeutic process of something like this, when you're a survivor of this kind of abuse and you're dealing with these very traumatic, painful things, that's not easy. It's very hard work to face these fears. I didn't even know until I was a little ways into therapy how fearful I was in my interactions with other people. I am so fear-driven in my interactions with other people, and I didn't know. It had always felt that way, so I just didn't realize that the way I felt was not normal, and it just took so much work. I mean, facing fear of anything is very hard. So it's hurtful enough that this process I went through that took a lot of courage and a lot of hard work, and I didn't give up. I kept pushing through when it got really hard. I mean, there were times I was facing pains that were suffocatingly painful, and I still pressed through because I wanted to be well and I wanted to have a better life for myself and my child. And to have that described as just some therapist manipulating me, especially when the timetable doesn't even factually line up. So anyway, I just feel like Dr. Coleman's words coming from somebody who has this level of education. If my mother or sister see that episode, and they probably have, because it's been talked about in these circles, it just validates what they're saying and going, so now they can show that to people and say, see, that's what happened in our family, when that's not at all what happened. And so, these narratives, this rhetoric, it has actual consequences on people's lives. It's not a small thing. And to me, Dr. Coleman is extremely irresponsible in so many of the things that he says. I looked this guy up online. The things he says are so irresponsible. They are so enabling of abusive, toxic parents. It really upset me that he was even on the show. But I am glad that there were two other therapists who were more realistic about this. And we're going to find out the difference between those two therapists and Dr. Coleman here in a little bit. Because the episode segues back to Dr. Coleman. And then he reveals that his own daughter went no contact with him for several years. And I do respect that he took some ownership to a degree of his part in that. She tried to talk to him about some difficulties in their relationship, and he says he responded with defensiveness and anger, and that pushed her away. So at first I'm thinking, okay, this guy has, he's owned what he did, and he had to learn to hear out her pain and stop making it about himself. Great. And then when he did that, they were able to reconcile. So it's so weird that he explained his story in this way, but then the rest of the episode, he is so condescending toward people who have gone no contact with a parent. He is so quick to blame them and says things that are actually quite terrible. He said, through that journey he went through, that he had parents who began to reach out to him because they had children who had chosen estrangement. And so he started collecting the reasons for their children going no contact, and he treated this like a study. He calls this actual data that he collected, and that's so unsettling to me. Do I even need to point this out, that he is collecting data from the parents on why their children have gone no contact? Now, he does say he talks to adult children who are no contact too, but he heavily, at least based on what I've seen him say, this data comes from what the parents say. I mean, think about my own story. If he talked to my mother and my sister and said, why did your daughter, your sister go no contact, they would say a therapist convinced me to. When again, I had been no contact long before I even began seeing this therapist. So is that data, is that valid? Of course not. If you're talking to people who have a kid who walked away from them, are you really going to get the true version of it? At the very least, why wouldn't you contact both and compare their answers? But he didn't do that. And Anyway, as we just discussed, that isn't what happened with me. That's likely what didn't happen with much of the parents in his quote data. He said, that there's therapists that are diagnosing people with narcissism. They're convincing people to cut off their parent. None of that is true. My therapist has never said, yeah, your mother is a covert narcissist. She's just going with, that's my understanding of my situation. My mother has not been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. She never will be. She'd have to go seek a therapist. And by the way, my brother has on numerous occasions tried to convince her to see a therapist to get some help. She will not do it. And, she whines about how she has this daughter who won't talk to her. All these parents do. When honestly, if I knew my mother was at least trying to treat me better, even if she was failing a lot, if I just saw the effort for her to do better, I would have contact with her again. I know that's never going to happen. I've accepted that. But hypothetically, that's all it would take. And that's where I get frustrated, because my mom talks like this is just such a deeply devastating thing for her. And yet I am asking so little of her to come back and to be welcomed back. And she won't do it. She would rather never see me or hear from me again. She would rather never see or hear from her grandson again than to just try to do better. Well, then they have a section of the audience that are adult children who are no contact with a parent. And they go to a man and his wife who is no contact with his entire immediate family. And they asked to explain, and he said his family was very performance-oriented. He goes into more detail than this, but basically they didn't approve of his girlfriend, who is his now wife. When they had a child, or when they were announced they were pregnant, the family was disappointed. They were constantly disparaging toward her, and they even talked to them like to their son, like he embarrassed them because he was with this girlfriend, that they didn't feel like she had achieved enough in life, that he hadn't achieved enough in life, and his mother tried to sabotage her bridal shower. There were all these problems, and they went to his parents. So again, this is not poor conflict resolution. They went to his parents and expressed how their behavior had made them feel. They expressed that it had been very hurtful. These are not people who are just cutting off parents who have not tried to work things out. That's so important to talk about, to point out, because in this dialogue, this narrative that people are just not even trying, they just walk away and give up, that's not what these stories ever have. They always talk about attempts they made and how their family was horrible to them in response, which is exactly what happened here. Again, the family responded by saying that this man and his wife were an embarrassment to the family, that they were embarrassed that they got married, they were embarrassed that they were having a child, and that they just completely disapproved of his wife. And then they just realized they didn't want to bring a child into this situation. And who would? He said his family had become so disinterested, and they just didn't want their children being treated that way by their family. And so that was unfortunately the last conversation with his family. Oprah asked him what gave him the idea to go no contact, and he gave a great answer, because again, it's just sort of implying this, was it an influencer? Was it whatever? And he said, it was really incremental, where the behavior little by little just became more and more intolerable until it accumulated to what was truly intolerable, which is usually how this happens. A lot of people seem to think, they misunderstand estrangement. They think that everything was more or less okay, just mild differences, and then there was some huge blow up, some big fight, and everybody got really angry, and then they just quit talking to each other. And that's just not really how this works. People get in fights like that in families, but they calm down over time and they come back to each other. That's sort of the normal pattern there. When people go no contact, it's because of ongoing abuse or harmful behavior that the parent or whoever the person is just refuses to stop doing, in spite of multiple requests. Interesting, the wife in the couple is also estranged from her family, but that's because her family is very religious. And as an adult, she chose not to follow that religion. And actually, her family disowned her. They went no contact with her. For everybody, they end, and Oprah asks them, what is your question for the experts? And so their question was, as their children grow, how do they talk to them about the fact they don't have extended family like so many other people do? And we're actually going to talk about this in another episode in this series. But they just said, at an age-appropriate level, communicate it. When they're 2 or 3 years old, they're probably not going to notice. But eventually you're going to notice that there are these things called grandparents and they don't have them. And so you just slowly explain it in a way that they can understand that's not overly traumatic and too upsetting. In another episode, I'm going to share what I did with my son, and not that I do everything right, but it did seem to match what they said here. And, Dr. Gibson, she chimed in and she said, when I thought this was good, when children are asking about it, or they're showing that curiosity, that's the signal that they're ready to start talking about it. So, and then Dr. Joshua Coleman jumped in, and this guy, if you haven't figured out by now, he just gives me the vibes. I don't like him. He tells these poor people who have been so mistreated by their families, this couple, that they are teaching their children how to, quote, handle conflict. And then he warns them that they are setting up their children to do it to them. Whew. As I said, I do not like this guy. And I want to take the time to address this right here for any of you out there who are parents and you're going through this. If you have gone no contact with an abusive parent, you are not teaching your kids anything bad. This couple that Dr. Coleman is talking to, they did go to their family. They did try to work things out. Their family refused to engage in that process. They shared their feelings and they were attacked in response. And the bottom line is it takes two to work through a conflict. And when only the adult child is willing and the parent is not, and it's so important to mention here that in a parent-child relationship, the parent has almost all the power. As a child, as a minor, the parent has all of the power. And adult children, then once you become an adult, there's no equal ground here. And yet, in spite of this, he's placed all the burden on the children in the relationship. They're the ones with the least power in a parent-child dynamic, and he's placed all of the burden of conflict resolution onto them. And really, okay, let's say it was these kids, these adult children, have no conflict resolution skills. Whose job was it to teach them conflict resolution skills? Because it wasn't their job to learn those skills by themselves. So let's talk about this Dr. Joshua Coleman. I got to get this out of my system. His Substack is a dumpster fire. I didn't go too deep into it because honestly what I was seeing on the surface was so upsetting. I was like, I've just seen enough, and I quit reading. But I just saw article after article where he blames the adult children for all the problems. He excuses away emotionally immature or abusive parents. He really emphasizes that kids are growing up in a time where they know more about trauma, they're more trauma informed, and their parents didn't. So there's this disconnect. And to a degree, that's true. But then he puts all the responsibility on the adult children to grow and accept their parents in spite of this, even when it means the parent is mistreating them. But then he doesn't tell parents that they need to grow and change. There's an internet. Where do you think us adult children are learning about all this trauma information? Get some books, read, educate yourself. But no, it's all on the child. I saw multiple videos where he's talking about adult children when they're sharing their traumas, and every time, and you'll actually see this some in the Oprah episode too if you watch it, but in his videos, when he talks about adult children sharing about their traumas, when he says the word trauma, he rolls his eyes over and over. I've seen him do this over and over. He has an article that he wrote that's exactly about what he's saying here, about these poor grandparents who don't get to see their grandkids because their children can't handle that their parents are flawed just like them. And he is just so tone deaf. His narrative is so tone deaf. I mean, he silences the voices of victims of abuse and amplifies the narrative of their abusers. Dr. Coleman, we didn't go no contact with our parent because they have flaws. We know people have flaws. We're not stupid. I went no contact with my mother because she is abusive, not because she's flawed. He consistently describes adult children as too weak to handle relationships. They're the root of the problem, and he downplays their traumas over and over and over. What he doesn't get, what so many do not get, is that the path of estrangement from a parent is a very painful, difficult one. We endure the smear campaigns from our abusers. Our parents turn other people against us. We lose other relationships. And we live with tremendous grief, especially early on, as we realize the parent we've always needed is never going to show up. We've spent decades working so hard trying to find a way to get our parent to just treat us with a basic level of respect and decency. Because we want that parent that loves us and cares for us to show up. We tried so hard. And then we have to realize that person doesn't even exist and never will. That is a pain that you cannot understand unless you've lived it. And then on top of that, we deal with society's judgment. After dealing with so much shame and blame from our parent, from our abuser, then we deal with it from society. And he enables this. I saw in some of the comments on articles about this episode, I saw in some comments on some of his articles where people are parents who have children who are estranged from them, and some who don't, but they're highlighting this warning he gave about, well, maybe your children will do it to you too. And they're literally laughing and expressing joy at the thought of our kids going no contact with us, like we deserve it. So I want to make it clear, because I'm sure you've heard this at times from people, and I know the self-doubt that has been programmed into us. So let's be very clear about this. You are absolutely not giving your child a bad lesson or setting a bad example if you went no contact with a parent who consistently mistreated you and refused to stop or have any respect for your feelings. I mean, I just love the example of asking people, what if I was dating a boyfriend who treated me the way I just described? Wouldn't you be begging me to leave this person? But for some reason, when it's a mother, they just get a pass. It's okay if they traumatize us. It's okay if they mistreat us again and again, and no matter how many times we beg them to stop, they just keep right on going. And somehow they get this pass where that's okay. And we're supposed to feel so sorry for them because they don't see their child and they don't see their grandchild. You think I want my son to have no grandparents? Of course I wish he had grandparents. But that just didn't work out. And it's really not in my control. I did try. I tried hundreds of times. I honestly think it was 1,000 times. I've tried to get my mother to stop being so abusive toward me, and it never made the slightest difference. And if you're in my shoes and you have children, you're teaching them a much better way to not tolerate ongoing mistreatment. This isn't about just, everybody makes mistakes. No one's perfect. We didn't ask for our parents to be perfect. That's not the expectation at all. We just could not continue to tolerate the ongoing mistreatment. This is what I've explained to my son and is what I exemplify in my daily life as well. People will make mistakes. We'll make mistakes. I'll make mistakes. I have made mistakes. He makes mistakes. And sometimes we will hurt the feelings of people we love and care about. And sometimes they're going to do that to us. And it's important that when we do that, we apologize. We acknowledge their feelings on the matter and do what we can to make things right and to do better. And when people hurt us, it's important that they apologize, that they acknowledge our feelings about it and do what they can to make it right. That's not an unreasonable expectation. So I explained that to my son, and I let him know that people are not perfect, and it's okay that we're not perfect. What matters is this undercurrent of care that the relationship is based on. But when there's someone who hurts you repeatedly and consistently, and they will not apologize, and they invalidate your feelings, and this happens again and again and again, and it's never any other way, and they absolutely refuse to even consider changing their behavior towards you, that it's okay to walk away from that person, no matter who it is. That's a very important lesson, and that's the example you're setting. I've had so many friendships and relationships with people who, they are emotionally immature. So some of them I'm pretty sure have been narcissists. I even dated someone that I've really come to understand in the last year ago. I think he may have been a psychopath. And if I told you some of the stories, you'd be deeply concerned. And yet I dated him. Like, why? Because my mother's abuse normalized tolerating mistreatment. I spent my childhood pushing the painful, abusive, terrible treatment just deep down inside so I could survive. I believed my mother loved me in spite of the complete absence of evidence for that, because as a child, the idea that one's mother doesn't care about their well-being, well, that's terrifying, because you're dependent on that parent to survive. It's understandable, but then I carried those habits into my adult relationships, and I tolerated so much harmful treatment that just led me to be even more traumatized. That's not what I want my son to go through. I want better for him. I want him to walk away from toxic, abusive people who don't respect his feelings. I want him to know that he doesn't owe anyone, not even me, a relationship. That must be earned. It's never automatic. It's never the default. It's on me to earn a relationship with my son. Right now, it's my moral and legal obligation to provide care for him. He's allowed to depend on me for the things he needs because that's the decision I made when I decided to become a mother. So for now, he pretty much has to have some sort of relationship with me because his life depends on it. But when he becomes an adult and he's no longer dependent on me for survival, then the only thing that's really left is our relationship. And if I have failed to build a strong, safe relationship with him during this time that he's dependent on me, then that's on me, because I hold all the power in our relationship right now. I've created an environment where he knows it's safe to let me know if I've hurt his feelings or caused him pain. I listen when he expresses those feelings. And I don't have any problem apologizing to my child. I'm setting his expectation from relationships that when someone does something wrong, you apologize. So that's what he's going to expect of himself, and that's what he's going to expect of others. And this bull crap of, this is a different generation we're talking about, and they don't know better, so kids just have to understand their parents are flawed. You know what? I didn't grow up. I'm almost 50 years old. I didn't grow up in this trauma-informed generation he's talking about. It was my job to learn that stuff. And mistreating your child over and over and over and invalidating their feelings over and over and over is more than a flaw. And I am disgusted to hear a trained therapist minimize this type of abuse. Parents hold the power in the relationships with their children. They hold the greatest responsibility in that relationship, but he excuses the parents away and places the blame and responsibility on the children. It's just unacceptable. He says in the episode, you're showing them that people can be cut out of your life. I just wanted to say, Dr. Coleman, yes, we know that. We want our children to know that. My son absolutely can cut people out of his life. This idea that our kids are going to just grow up and leave us because they saw us do it to our parents is ridiculous. I tried to work things out with my mother countless times. and not one conversation was ever heard on any level. And my son cannot say the same, because he has come to me. He has told me I've upset him, and I listened, and we worked it out. Thankfully, one of the other therapists jumps in and kind of subtly put him in his place. He said, what they're passing on to their children is that what you feel inside matters. And what we are role modeling is that if people are mistreating us, they have the right to distance themselves to whatever level is necessary. And that's preparing them for adult life. We're not saying you can just cut anyone out for no reason. And that is the end of part 2. I'll have part 3 up tomorrow, so I'll see you then. And please remember, to all my fellow survivors, you are worthy, you are valuable, and you are beautiful, whether your mom sees that or not.